This is the Alfred Russel Wallace podcast for Biology 1610.
Alfred Russel Wallace was a power player in the biology dream team. He co-discovered natural selection with the influence of Charles Darwin. Wallace has been forgotten by history, eclipsed by the fame of Charles Darwin, but their research was very similar. During Wallace's lifetime, Europe was in turmoil with revolution in France. Britain was in war with Russia, and lots of other rioting and bloodshed was going on. While many people were traveling to South America to explore the exotic jungles and wildlife, the perfect place of study for a biology maverick like Alfred Russel Wallace was Malay.
He was born in Wales and attended grammar school until he was 14 because they didn't have the money. He then moved to London to board with his older brother as an apprentice surveyor. He did this for 6 years and then moved back to Wales to do surveying. He did this work in the countryside of England and Wales. After a brief stint of unemployment, he was hired as a master at the collegiate school in Lincolnshire to teach surveying. This is where he met Henry Bates. Bates got Alfred to start collecting beetles and other insects. His work as a surveyor led him in the outdoors, allowing him to study beetles and other insects. During this time, he read many books and was inspired by the works of Charles Darwin and Alexander von Humboldt. He decided to travel abroad as a naturalist. He and Bates set out for Brazil with intention to collect specimens and bring and sell them back to England. They spent over 10 years collecting in South America. They were charting the area and making notes on the peoples and languages they encountered. On July 12, 1852, they left to go back to England. After days at sea, the ship caught fire and most of the notes and specimens were lost. They were picked up by a loan ship and taken back to Europe. During this time, Alfred wrote many papers on his travels in South America. He made connections to scientists like Darwin and other biology scientists. And then later in his work, he traveled to the Malay archipelago where he did his more profound work.
In Malay, he studied a lot of different organisms. For example, he studied the orangutan, and he studied how he his what he did and how he acted, and he figured out that the orangutan was very closely related to people. And later he would study insects, and he figured out that they had subtle variations, and that the subtle variations matter for life and death. And this came to him figuring out the theory of natural selection. I don't know what else, but
The Wallace line.
oh yeah, Wallace line. He figured out from traveling on each of the islands that the western islands were all part of Asia, and they all had Asian animals, and on the eastern islands they had descendants of the Australian animals like marsupials and all of that, and he kind of came up with the Wallace line, which split the east and the west and that was a big part of his studies in the Malay Islands. When he had figured out natural selection, he sent a paper to Darwin, and Darwin, he had already figured out the theory of natural selection. He hadn't published it yet. He went out and he noticed that Wallace's papers, his studies were pretty similar, were almost the exact same thing as as what he had studied and figured out when he was in what the Galapagos Islands. Okay, and then Wallace went through and he published the paper calling it the Darwin-Wallace theory, but he hadn't even asked Wallace for his permission yet. But Wallace didn't even mind because he was just in science just because he loved science. And that's all, basically, a lot of his work.
Alfred Russel Wallace was awarded many very different scientific awards for his work, and he is considered today still to be one of the greatest biologists of all time. Alfred Russel Wallace.
Alfred Russel Wallace.